All right, it's 3:30. We'll go ahead and get started here. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, sponsored by the California Fire Science Consortium and part of the UC Davis Farrell Lecture Series, which stands for the Forest and Fire Ecology Random Lectures. My name is Allie Paulson, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. I'm the coordinator for the Sierra Nevada region of the California Fire Science Consortium, which is a fire science outreach organization. Our mission includes increasing communication between fire researchers, managers, policymakers, tribes, landowners, homeowners, and other stakeholders. The California Fire Science Consortium is part of the nationwide Fire Science Exchange Network, funded through the Joint Fire Science Program. So first of all, a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and we will post it within the next week to our website at the California Fire Science Consortium, along with our YouTube channel. And on those recordings, we'll include closed captioning. If you're having any technical issues, feel free to send me, Allie Paulson, a private chat, and I can help you once we get started. We'll be using the chat function in Zoom to collect questions for our speaker. Feel free to type a question here at any time, and we'll address them at the end of Jesse's talk in the order received. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jesse Miller. Jesse is an ecologist who is interested in the effects of global change factors, such as altered fire regimes, on plant and lichen communities. He worked as a botanist and ecologist for several years prior to completing his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2016, where he studied the effects of habitat connectivity on Ozark grassland plant communities. He's currently a lecturer at Stanford, where he teaches ecology classes, including inquiry-based courses that engage undergraduates in real-world ecological research. Jesse loves sharing his passion for the natural world with others. And without further ado, I'll pass the presentation over to Dr. Jesse Miller.
Well, thank you, Dr. Paulson. It's really great to be here today, and nice to see some familiar, I would say faces, but some familiar black boxes there. Thanks everyone for coming out, such as it is. Anyway, I'll be talking today about several different projects I have worked on over the last few years with the overarching theme of exploring fire effects on plant and lichen diversity across different fire regimes. So, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, we're living in an era when many ecosystems are experiencing shifts away from the historical patterns of recurring fire or fire regimes that they've had for a long time. In some cases, we're seeing more severe fires, more frequent fires. As I'm sure many people here are aware, we're seeing an increase in the average size of wildfires in the Western US. One major pattern here in California, especially in lower elevation ecosystems, is an increase in fire severity. And for anyone who's not familiar with this term, I'm using fire severity to refer to the effects of fire on vegetation. So I'll mostly be talking about forested ecosystems today, where high severity fires are stand replacing fires where most or all of the trees are killed, and low severity fires are fires where most of the trees survive. And so the overarching question I've been interested in and trying to study from multiple angles over the last several years is trying to understand how altered fire regimes affect biodiversity, particularly the biodiversity of plants and lichens. A lot of fire ecology research is really focused on trees. Of course, tree regeneration after fire, after high severity fire, is critically important for future ecosystems, but we often don't think as much about how the understory plants may be responding to fires. But of course, plants support all higher trophic levels. If we lose our wildflowers, the pollinators, of course, are dependent upon them. So even though we may not think about them much, plant responses to fire are a really important consideration. And one reason for that is because we do have the opportunity to alter how fires burn through pre-fire management activities. We know that if we go thin, dense stands of forest future fires that burn will likely burn at lower severity. But resources to do this kind of management are very limited. So research into fire effects can help us apply these resources as wisely as possible. Ecologists have made some predictions about how we might expect biodiversity to respond to disturbance. And probably the most well-known ecological disturbance theory is the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which suggests that biodiversity should be maximized at intermediate disturbance frequencies and or intermediate disturbance severities or intensities. So the idea is there's kind of a happy medium where we should see the highest species richness when it comes to disturbance regimes, at least in the case of sites that are moderately productive. Some versions of this theory and related bodies of work suggest that at really low productivity sites, we might see a mostly negative effect of increasing fire severity or disturbance frequency. And then at the other end of the spectrum, at really high productivity sites, we might see mostly positive effects of increasing fire severity and or frequency. But when it comes to looking at real world data, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis hasn't really panned out very well. It predicts that these hump-shaped relationships should be fairly common. And one review found that only 16% of studies actually found hump-shaped relationships when they looked at real-world communities after disturbances. And so when I was working at UC Davis a few years ago, working with Hugh Safford, we began trying to think, what other explanations are out there that ecological theory hasn't considered. And one really important clue when it comes to plant diversity is that plants have a lot of different adaptations and apparent adaptations to fire. So this is a photo from the east side of the Sierra. It's the area that burned in the Walker fire. And I took this photo the year after the fire. And all these prickly poppies had sprung up in an area that had previously been sagebrush steppe. And this species probably has seeds that are adapted to germinate after fire, which is a great example of a adaptation to fire. Another example is that a lot of species have underground structures that can allow them to resprout after fire, while other species can't resprout at all. So scaling this up to the big picture at a landscape scale, we'd expect that the group of species that grow in a region or a regional species pool has been filtered by historical fire regimes. And so the group of species in a given region should have traits or adaptations that make them well suited to the fires that historically occurred in a given region. So in regions that historically had a lot of low severity fire, we'd expect to see species with a suite of traits that helps them do well under those conditions. And in an ecosystem that had more high severity fire, we'd expect to see other traits. For example, serotiny is more common in ecosystems that have historically had more high severity fire. But this hasn't been applied to herbaceous plants as much as people have looked into this for trees. So how do we actually explore this in the real world? One convenient gradient in historical fire regimes corresponds to an elevation gradient in Montane, California. At lower elevations, we see ecosystems that historically burned frequently and mostly at low severity. So yellow pine and mixed conifer forests historically had a lot of ground fires, but not so much stand replacing fire prior to European colonization in North America. And of course, part of this is because of indigenous fire management, frequent fires at low elevation, which went on for a long time, of course. As you move into higher elevations, ecosystems burned less frequently, and when they did burn, they burned at higher severity, and that's still true today, actually. And at higher elevations, there has not been as much of a departure from historical fire regimes in the contemporary era. So in red fir forests, we see what we might call moderate severity fire regimes or mixed severity fire regimes. And then as you move up to subalpine forests, these really climate limited systems where it's cold, it's damp a lot of the time. You only have fires pretty rarely when conditions are right. So in the work I'm going to talk about today, we took advantage of these kinds of gradients to look at how plant communities respond to fire differently in different forest types. So the hypothesis that Hugh and I came up with was we expected that in lower elevation forests, or forests that historically burned more at low severity, we expected that plant diversity would be maximized after low to moderate severity fires. We figured, most species don't have adaptations that allow them to either survive or rapidly recolonize after high severity fire. So we expected diversity after high severity fire would be pretty low. And we expected as you move up into more moderate severity regimes, there should be a more positive response to high severity fire. And we expected to see the most positive responses of plant species richness to fire severity in ecosystems that historically had primarily high severity fires, such as subalpine forests. And so to explore this overarching hypothesis, we did a couple things. We conducted a literature review and I looked up all the papers I could find that had examined post-fire plant communities in Western conifer forests, anywhere in Western North America. And then we also did a field study in collaboration with several colleagues looking at a couple different forest types and post-fire plant communities in those forests. The literature review is already published. So I'll just briefly show you a couple of results from that, and then I'll go on and talk about the field study in more detail. So this is a map of the studies we found that we included in the literature review. And in this map, the black dots are all studies that just studied a single study site. And then the color-coded dots represent studies that had multiple study sites. So you can see we found about 35 different studies, or study sites at least. And they were arranged in kind of a ring around the Great Basin, spanning all the major historical fire regimes in Western conifer forests. And we summarized the results in a table, and I'll just kind of tell you what it's saying. I know this is a lot of info to actually read, but so the color coding here is the historical fire regime. So the green is areas that mostly had low severity fire historically, moderate severity fire in yellow, and ecosystems with more high severity fire in red. And what we found was that positive linear responses to fire severity, so where species richness increased linearly with fire severity, seemed to be slightly more common in ecosystems that did indeed have more high severity fire historically. And we tended to see either hump-shaped relationships or relationships that were positive at first and then leveled off, or plateau relationships in ecosystems that historically had more low severity fire. And this is obviously kind of a crude approach. It's what they call a vote counting approach. We didn't do a quantitative meta-analysis, partly because there was just so much variation in the methods, the different plot designs. It seemed pretty messy. But I think, the big picture take-home message here is our hypothesis at least seems plausible considering the existing literature. But this also really highlights that you need to do a study that uses consistent methods across multiple different fire regimes to really investigate how plant responses to fire severity vary across these different fire regimes. Because it's really hard to compare a bunch of different studies that use different methods. So to that end, we spent a couple field seasons doing field studies in 2 different forest types in the Sierra Nevada. We looked at yellow pine and mixed conifer forests, which are ecosystems that historically burned pretty frequently, mostly at low severity. And then we also looked at red fir forests, which are moderate, moderate severity, mixed severity ecosystems, moderate frequency, moderate severity. Definitely, up the gradient, but not all the way at the end of subalpine forests. But my colleague Emily Brody has been studying subalpine forest understory plant responses to fire in recent years. So there'll be some exciting work on that frontier coming out soon as well. So our predictions for the field study were, first of all, we expected to see more positive species richness responses to fire severity in forests that historically had more high severity fire. But we also expected to see greater phylogenetic diversity in forests that historically had more high severity fire. And for anyone who's not familiar with the concept of phylogenetic diversity, this is a little cartoon that tries to illustrate it. So these blue lines represent evolutionary trees or phylogenies. And so the tips along the top of the tree represent species. And so if you imagine a community that has 3 species that all come from branches that are close together on the tree, these are closely related species in this community. So we'd call this a low phylogenetic diversity community. And in contrast, this community on the right here, you can see that the species come from branches that share relatively distant common ancestors. You have to go way up the tree to find where they connect. So we'd call this a high phylogenetic diversity community. And we imagined that in ecosystems that had more of a long-term history of high severity fire, more species in diverse clades would have adaptations to high severity fire. And then there's one more piece in this puzzle I want to talk about before I show you our results. As anyone who's spent a lot of time in areas that have burned in the Sierra Nevada knows, in yellow pine and mixed conifer forests, we're seeing very large patches that burn at high severity. So this is an area that burned in the Angora fire in 2007, and I took this photo 9 years later. And you can see that we're looking out on an area of about 1,000 acres where pretty much all the trees were killed. It's been converted to a shrubland. There's been very little tree regeneration. And I can tell you, I was just up there a few weeks ago. It's still shrubland. It's probably going to be shrubland for the foreseeable future. And in this kind of ecosystem, although of course there was always some high severity fire, we believe that it historically happened in much smaller patches. You know, this is really, there was probably very little historical analog for this size of high severity burn patch. And so when we think about fire severity at the landscape scale, this may also have effects on plant diversity in addition to the effects of local fire severity. These large, relatively homogeneous high severity burn patches may not have as high a plant diversity as an area that's more heterogeneous in fire severity. And so a term that ecologists use for this is pyrodiversity, or spatial heterogeneity in fire history at a landscape scale. And so I hypothesized that greater pyrodiversity would correspond to greater plant diversity, all else being equal. So another way to look at this, this is a map of fire severity of a small fire. And so if you think of each of these black circles as a landscape, you might imagine that a landscape that consists of a more diverse range of different fire severities might have higher plant diversity than a landscape consisting entirely of high severity fire, especially since we know that's probably been converted to a pretty dense shrubland that may not support a lot of herbaceous biodiversity. So my third hypothesis here is higher plant diversity with increasing pyrodiversity. So I just want to acknowledge that all this work I'm talking about, sampling this network of fires, has been collaborative research with several different people. There's a group of us at UC Davis who've all been working together to sample fires across the Sierra Nevada. So all people collaborating with Hugh Safford, Clark Richter, Emily Brody, and Jonah Weeks. And each of us is kind of taking our own unique angle on this. Clark has already published one of his papers, and each of these people has more stuff in the works. So it's really going to give us some pretty cool new insights into how plants are responding to fire severity in the Sierra Nevada. And then I have several collaborators who've contributed to this work from outside UC Davis as well, Daijong Lee, Ali Weil, John Villela, and Heather Root, several of whom contributed to my work on lichen responses to fire. So thanks to all the collaborators. This is really a group effort. So in the research I'm going to talk about today, I'll present results from 9 different fires that we sampled in 2016 and 2017 in the Sierra Nevada. And on the map, the yellowish orange triangles are the yellow pine and mixed conifer forests, and the red triangles are the red fir forests. And we've actually, but between this whole group of collaborators that I just mentioned, we've actually sampled a lot more fires than this. We have a data set that I think is approaching 30 fires now. So it's really giving us the potential for some really cool new insights, because so much of the existing research on fire effects on understory plants has a pretty small sample size. Most studies just look at a single fire or at most a handful of fires. And of course, this makes it difficult to generalize patterns across broad ecological gradients. Most studies don't span multiple historical fire regimes. So I think one key to understanding this major challenge that's kind of stumped ecological theoreticians for decades, if not centuries, is really establishing really broad scale quantitative data sets. Because it's, as we all know, it's a lot of work to go out and collect this field data, but I think it's really the way we're going to better understand how fire is affecting plant diversity. So I'll talk about research today from these 9 fires. Some of the analyses I'll present are from just a subset of these fires, and we sampled all of them between 5 and 15 years after the original burns. And so the way we did these studies was we went out to areas that had burned, and we established study plots across the full gradient of fire severity, from areas that burned at high severity to areas that burned at low severity. And then we also established plots outside of the fire perimeter, which of course were what we can think of as control plots to represent what we think the unburned condition was like before the fire. And to evaluate how pyrodiversity or fire severity heterogeneity in the surrounding landscape affected plant communities, I calculated the standard deviation of the proportion of different fire severity classes in 250-meter buffers surrounding each of the plots. I actually looked at a few different spatial scales. The results weren't drastically different between different scales, but I picked 250 meters as kind of a reasonable compromise. So basically our study plots were just big circles, big imaginary circles. This is one of our study sites in a red fir forest in Yosemite, an area that burned at the very edge of the Rim Fire. And so we went around in the big circles and just noted what plants were present, also lichens for some of the stuff I'll talk about later. So I'll show you our results, just going back through the order of our original hypotheses. So we'd predicted more positive species richness in response to fire severity in the higher elevation red fir forests in comparison to yellow pine forests. So this is basically what we expected, just to refresh your memory. We expected the biggest difference to be in the areas that burned at high severity. And for the yellow pine and mixed conifer forests, we did see a hump-shaped relationship, which is basically what we expected. So plant diversity after fire was greatest in areas that burned at moderate severity. There was actually no difference, no significant difference between plant species richness between unburned, low, and high severity burn patches. And then when we moved up into the red fir forest, we did see something more or less like we expected. I was actually, as anyone, as all the ecologists in the audience know, ecological studies don't usually work out that cleanly. Yeah, this one actually shook out, pretty close to what we were expecting. You just never know how things will go out there. We did see kind of this, a bit of a hump, but it really levels off. We don't see the line going all the way back down. The difference between unburned plots and high severity plots was marginally significant. The p-value was like 0.055. So once again, diversity was maximized in areas that burned at moderate severity, but high severity fire didn't seem to have quite the intense homogenizing effect on the plant community that we saw in the yellow pine and mixed conifer forest. And then going on to my second hypothesis or prediction, we thought we'd see more positive phylogenetic diversity responses to fire severity in red fir forest. So these are the phylogenetic diversity responses. This is on the y-axis, this is mean phylogenetic distance, which is a phylogenetic diversity metric. So basically in yellow pine and mixed conifer forest, phylogenetic diversity was greatest in unburned forest, and it decreased progressively with increasing fire severity. So we had plants, we had the least amount of evolutionary diversity in the plant community in areas that burned at high severity. In contrast, in red fir forest, we actually didn't see a significant relationship between fire severity and mean phylogenetic distance. There appears to be a slight negative trend here, but it wasn't significant. So these results do seem to suggest that yellow pine and mixed conifer forests may be experiencing not only a homogenization of taxonomic identities of plants, but we actually may be filtering out some of the evolutionary diversity when we have a lot of high severity fire in these ecosystems that historically had relatively little high severity fire. And so this is just kind of all the results together, more or less seems to line up between the richness results and the phylogenetic diversity results. And then for the last prediction, the expectation that overall higher plant diversity would be associated with increasing pyrodiversity. So this is an effects plot from a model. Sorry, it's a little fuzzy here, but this is pyrodiversity on the x-axis and plant species richness scaled on the y-axis. And you can see there does seem to be a positive effect that tapers off after a certain level of pyrodiversity is reached, which sort of makes sense. You might not expect that, the very finest level of very high pyrodiversity would make a big difference. And this is an effects plot from a model that also included local severity and environmental variables. So I was trying to control for some of the other stuff that might matter to really understand these landscape scale effects, which can be kind of subtle and difficult to tease out. So then I wanted to compare the strength of the effect of pyrodiversity to the effect of local fire severity. And you can see that local fire severity does appear to have a slightly stronger effect on understory plant species richness, but the effect of pyrodiversity is still pretty substantial in comparison. And I think this is important to note because the vast majority of fire ecology research focuses, at least for plant communities, focuses on local fire severity. And very few studies have actually looked at pyrodiversity and plant diversity. So I think these results suggest this may be an important thing that we're really overlooking. In some cases it may be almost as important or just as important as local fire severity. So I think there's really some fruitful ground for further exploration in the future. But how does this all fit together, in the real world with many different interacting variables? One framework that I've been thinking about, is the idea that, local canopy cover is really a function of local fire severity, but pyrodiversity may be influencing both shrub cover and plant species richness, which of course may interact. And this is something Clark Richter's been working on. He's doing a lot of work looking at interactions between shrubs and plant richness. But it may be that, more heterogeneous burn patterns, may prevent these vast shrublands from forming. And I'm not saying shrubs are all bad. Obviously, these are native plants that serve important ecological roles. But I do think that these novel shrublands that are, thousands of acres in extent, may be providing limited ecological benefit in comparison to the more heterogeneous landscapes that could be possible if we saw greater pyrodiversity. That's just my opinion. I'll be interested to hear yours in the Q&A. So I'll just wrap this up with a few conclusions, and then I'll just talk briefly about some of the lichen research before I call it a day here. So it appears that both local and landscape scale burn patterns both seem to affect plant communities. So I think this really highlights the importance of just thinking about fire at multiple spatial scales. Our results suggest through multiple lines of evidence that plant communities are being homogenized in the core area of really large high severity burn patches. So, the species richness results, the phylogenetic diversity results and the pyrodiversity results all kind of point to this. And finally, these findings suggest that severe fire does have more negative effects on plant diversity in ecosystems that historically didn't have a lot of high severity fire. So, you look at studies out of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, we often see much more positive plant diversity responses to fire severity. So we really have to consider the role of historical contingency. Ecosystems are different. And of course, I know I'm speaking to a lot of ecologists. I'm sure most of us are used to thinking about this kind of thing, but perhaps it's something, it's something I certainly try to emphasize a lot when I'm speaking to public audiences or talking to media people. I think it's a really important message to get out there. And then looking at this from a management angle, we know that thinning dense stands at low elevations can promote plant diversity. There's actually just, the thinning studies provide very comprehensive and very convincing evidence of this. But this is also contingent upon historical fire regimes. There probably wouldn't be benefits to thinning dense stands in high elevation ecosystems that historically have had a lot of high severity fire. But in low elevation ecosystems like yellow pine and mixed conifer forest, there's potentially some really good benefits to thinning. Since we know that heterogeneous fire severity may support the greatest biodiversity, this suggests that creating heterogeneous forest structure before fires come through could, produce the greatest post-fire plant diversity. Not to say that, plant diversity needs to be our absolute #1 goal. Certain the total richness is not necessarily the only response variable of interest, but I do think it's a response variable that's worth paying attention to. So one thing I've been thinking about is, if pyrodiversity is good for plant diversity, is thinning stands in kind of a patchy way where we get patches of different burn severities, potentially something to think more about. And just, one final message on this. There's so much interest in fire among the general public these days. There's so much media coverage of it. So I've just been telling my students, you can tell a really good article about fire because it'll mention historical fire regimes, because that's just such an important piece of the puzzle. So I hope all the journalists in the audience will be sure to include notes on historical fire regimes in your upcoming work. So I want to go on and just talk briefly about some research I've been doing on lichens, moving on from plants. I'm sure this is what everyone's really been waiting to hear about. For anyone who's not familiar, lichens are symbiotic organisms that contain both fungal and photosynthesizing partners. They're a really important component of biodiversity in almost every terrestrial ecosystem. They play important roles in nutrient cycling. And there's really not been very much research on how lichens respond to altered fire regimes. One of my favorite examples of why lichens are ecologically important is because they're a key food source for flying squirrels, which are in turn a key food source for northern spotted owls, which are, of course, one of our great animals of, iconic conservation species of Western North America. So if we lost our horsehair lichens, that'd be really bad for the spotted owls. So I find that, if people don't care about lichens directly, most people care about animals. So you can care about lichens by proxy. And California is actually a really interesting place to study lichens because we have the highest lichen diversity in North America by a pretty good margin, according to a recent analysis by Aaron Tripp and James Lendemer. But there really has been very little research on California lichens. At least certainly not research proportional to the diversity of lichens here compared to elsewhere in North America. So I'll just briefly talk about two different studies that address two different questions. First of all, how long does it take for lichen communities to reestablish after fire? And how does fire severity affect lichen diversity? So this first study took place in chaparral shrublands in Napa County at the UC Davis Quail Ridge Reserve. And this is a collaboration with Ali Weil and John Villela. For anyone who's not familiar with chaparral, it's one of California's most iconic ecosystems, these dense shrublands that burn at high severity when they burn. It's thought of as an ignition limited system. So basically anytime there's an ignition source, you can have a high severity fire in chaparral. And historically, it's believed that chaparral burned relatively infrequently, usually at least several decades between fires, maybe as long as a century or more. And we've seen a major increase in fire frequency in chaparral in recent decades, especially in SoCal, but to some extent in Northern California as well. So I know what you're asking. How is this affecting the lichens? Well, I'll tell you. And there's a somewhat controversial concept of old growth chaparral. People have asked whether is there really ecological value in these long unburned chaparral stands that we still have in some places on the landscape. Should we be concerned that chaparral is starting to burn more frequently, or is it really not a big deal? But one thing that any casual observer can see is that old growth chaparral in particular can have really high lichen biomass and diversity. Looking at this photo of some old growth chaparral, it's almost hard to see the twigs because they're covered in so many lichens. And there are also a lot of lichen species of conservation concern that grow in chaparral as their primary habitat. So to analyze how fast chaparral lichens reestablish after fire, we did a study at Quail Ridge examining areas with different fire histories. And this was in, I can't remember if we did the field work in 2017 or 2018, but this was before the Hennessy fire a few months ago. So as many of you know, Quail Ridge, the entire reserve burned in a pretty intense fire just a few months ago. But this was before that, so there was a much more heterogeneous mix of fire histories on the landscape prior to the Hennessy fire. So this is a map of the different fires that had burned at Quail Ridge. So we had a really nice gradient of fire history. We actually had some sites at the Stebbins Cold Canyon Reserve as well, just across the inlet from Quail Ridge. And we had fires that had burned as recently as 3 years prior to sampling. And then a nice gradient going all the way back to a 65-year-old fire. And then we also sampled some old growth chaparral plots in areas that we believe hadn't burned for at least 100 years. So these are our results. This is time since fire on the x-axis and lichen richness on the y-axis. So you can see that lichen richness really increases dramatically for a couple decades after fire and then starts to level off, although it still increases gradually, just not in a really statistically significant way. But one interesting thing was that there were certain functional groups, particularly cyanolichens, that only occurred in the long unburned stands, the areas that hadn't burned in 100 years or more. And there also appeared to be greater overall gamma diversity or landscape scale diversity in the long unburned stands relative, so substantially longer even than the areas that had burned 65 years ago. So this suggests, there really may be something to the concept of old growth chaparral, at least in terms of its effects on lichen diversity. So I'll just show you a few photos of what the landscape looked like. This was the area that had burned 3 years prior. This is John in the area that burned 13 years prior. So you can see it's getting bigger, but it's still, only about waist height or chest height. We're starting to get some really big shrubs 65 years after fire, but it really wasn't until, it wasn't for 100 years or more after fire that we got these really dense shrub canopies where we were really just crawling around under the shrubs. And these were the only places where we found the cyanolichens, these beautiful little dark blobs on the trunks of the old growth chamise there. Even though species richness leveled off in 20 to 30 years, the fact that some species and functional groups were only found in the long unburned areas suggests that for lichens, there really may be some value to these long unburned stands. Is it possible to maintain old growth chaparral in an era of increasing fire frequency? I think it's going to be a difficult thing to do, but I do think trying to maintain at least some of these remnant stands of old growth chaparral would be a nice goal from the perspective of lichens. But it's also important to recognize that sometimes, managers go out and just mow down huge areas of chaparral to try to create fire breaks. And of course, this isn't great for the old growth chaparral lichens either. So probably take something of a balance in management approaches. And I'll go on and briefly touch on one more lichen study. This one is already published as well, so I'm going to keep it short. In this study, we looked at 5 different fires in yellow pine and mixed conifer forests, as well as some in red fir forests in the Sierra Nevada. And instead of focusing on time since fire here, we looked at fire severity because, of course, in contrast to the chaparral, in these conifer forests, we see a much broader gradient of fire severities. And we found that lichen diversity drops off pretty dramatically as fire severity increases. In areas that burned at low severity, we actually saw no measurable effect of fire on lichen communities. Of course, a lot of the lichens are up in the tree canopies, and low severity fires are generally just burning on the ground. So that's not really a huge surprise, but it is still kind of a cool finding because, you know, we're often using prescribed fire in some of these ecosystems, which usually burns at low severity. And it's good to know that we can probably do prescribed fires in these ecosystems without causing much harm to the lichen communities that are there. But in contrast, these really large high severity burn patches seem to be almost entirely eliminating lichens from the landscape. And it may be a long time till they come back. We'd imagine that, you know, the forest has to reestablish first before the environmental conditions they need are going to be there. And it's, you know, not really a shocking result. We know that lichens burn up. You know, lichens really don't have any obvious adaptations to fire, you know, the way that plants do. But I think it was still a bit of a surprise to see how dramatic the shifts were, even to me, and I was expecting it. And then one other result here, we found that there was a pretty strong relationship between tree overstory cover and lichen richness in these plots. But the interesting thing was that lichen richness basically topped out at about 40 to 50% overstory cover. And increasing cover past that point didn't increase lichen richness. And this is kind of cool because the management target for thinning stands in these lower elevations here in Nevada forests is 40% cover, I believe. So it suggests we can, you know, thin these stands to historical densities without harming lichen communities. In fact, there's some research from the Pacific Northwest, some stuff Heather Root has done, showing that thinning really dense young stands can actually increase lichen diversity. And one last thing from this study, we put it together into a structural equation model to just try to understand how fire severity and tree height and canopy cover were all interacting and potentially affecting lichen richness. And so you can think of this as a flow chart if you're not familiar with structural equation models, where thicker arrows represent stronger causal relationships. So the main take-home message here is it appears that fire severity can have both direct and indirect effects on lichen diversity. It obviously affects lichens directly by burning them up, but it seems to also indirectly affect them by removing the forest canopy and creating warmer, drier conditions. It also reduces, the decreased canopy is also associated with decreased average tree height, which actually has its own effect on lichen communities. The lichens seem to be more diverse in stands with taller trees, all else being equal, which is kind of cool because there's also been, I think Malcolm North published a paper finding that spotted owls had a preference for taller trees as well. So yeah, you know, what a better deal could you get? You maintain some tall trees, you get lichens and spotted owls. So in conclusion, large high severity burn patches may lead to long-term lichen diversity losses. And it appears that thinning and prescribed fire are unlikely to harm lichen communities and may actually benefit lichens in the long run, especially because these practices can prevent high severity fire, which is obviously not going to be good for lichens in these ecosystems. With that, I'd like to thank all my collaborators, all the field workers who contributed, Hugh Safford for putting the fun in funding, and finally, all the undergrads who contributed to this work. I had some really wonderful undergrads who helped out in a lot of different ways. And thanks to Ellen Dean and the Herbarium for plant ID help. Anyway, that's all I have. I'll just say one last thing. If there are any people out there who are also studying plant understory responses to fire and perhaps some other ecosystem, I'm kind of envisioning ultimately creating a network of people studying plant community responses to fire in many different ecosystems. I think, establishing these really big data sets is one of the best ways we can understand what's going on across ecological gradients. So feel free to get in touch if you want to collaborate on some big synthesis project at some point. Yeah, here's my contact info. I'd love to hear from anyone, and happy to take some questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Jesse, for that great presentation. I've been noting the questions as they started to come into the chat box, and feel free to type any further questions as you think of them in the chat box to be found at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you haven't found it yet. Also, I just posted in that chat box a evaluation survey for the seminar, and we use your evaluation responses as input for future webinars and to report back to our funding organization to show that these are useful for our audiences.
So
and especially this year, yeah, especially this year where everything's been virtual, being able to hear about how these presentations are helpful and how they're being received is really important for us. So go ahead and fill it out. It's like 3 questions and we'll be very quick for you to fill out. Okay, so let me pull up the questions we've had so far. The first question is from John Williams, and he asks, why did you have the expectation of higher phyllodiversity with increasing fire severity? I think of general patterns of phyllodiversity across plant communities and gradients where biotic factors like competition tend to mediate greater phyllodiversity compared to abiotic ones like cold or fire.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's so I guess, maybe I didn't phrase this totally clearly. Really, I was just thinking of it as as a relative increase in phyllodiversity in areas that burned at high severity in red fir forest as compared to yellow pine. I wasn't necessarily expecting that phyllodiversity would actually increase with fire severity, but just that it would be, it would be higher in red fir relative to yellow pine, even if they both had negative responses. So yeah, so that's the part of the, I was presenting some published work here, but it's the actual field studies of the plant diversity stuff that I haven't published yet. And so that's kind of my final, the final project from all this work I did during my postdoc that I'm still working on. So I'm actually really interested to hear people's comments and suggestions, because there's, I can still add in more stuff. So yeah, that's great stuff to think about. And I'm not super experienced with phyllodiversity, so yeah, I'll keep that in mind. I appreciate the question.
Great. All right, the next question is from Zach Steele. He says, nice talk, Jesse. Do you think that variation in fire frequency or time since fire would also promote plant diversity? Or is variation in severity the most important part of pyrodiversity?
Yeah, really good question. And yeah, we can certainly, pyrodiversity can be defined in a lot of different ways. Short answer, I think probably, yeah, multiple dimensions of pyrodiversity could be really important for plants. I do think in, these ecosystems where we're seeing these just really large high severity burn patches, that's potentially, one of the more important dimensions. But I think the interaction of time and fire severity would actually be really interesting to look at. Yeah, maybe it's time for a new pyrodiversity metric, the multiplied index. No, that's a great question, Zach. That's something I'd like to talk with you more about at some point. And maybe I'll just make a plug. While we're on that topic, Zach and I have actually organized a symposium on pyrodiversity for the International Association of Landscape Ecology conference, which was supposed to be in Reno, but it's going to be on the internet now in early April. So check it out. We're going to have something like 8 or 10 different people doing research on pyrodiversity across basically like every taxonomic group you can think of presenting. And maybe I'll have analyzed my data using a more comprehensive range of pyrodiversity metrics by then.
Great, that sounds like a good symposium to attend. Our next question is from Greg Suba. Very interesting stuff, thanks. Regarding pyrodiversity and phyllodiversity, Do you know of any comparable studies for east side forest types? For instance, in the Inyo National Forest, I don't remember if your fire location slide included east side and whether your conclusions are applicable there too.
Great question. Short answer, no, I don't know of any. All my fires that I presented today were west side. We actually did sample the Walker fire on the east side up by Lee Vining, but it seemed a little weird to put it in with all these west side studies. And it actually, yeah, maybe I should look at that. And then Emily Brody, my colleague, who's looking at subalpine forests, which are, often technically on the east side at least, will be publishing a paper soon with her results. So keep an eye out for that. But her fires are really small, so it's not really possible to look at pyrodiversity because there's just not very much pyrodiversity up there. But perhaps we'll analyze phylodiversity across the whole data set at some point. I think that'd be really cool. So yeah, stay tuned. There's going to be a lot of good plant response to fire papers coming out from the Safford Lab in the next 2 years, I would predict. Lord willing and the creek don't rise.
Okay, our next question is from Jeffrey Schloss. So lichen richness increases with time since fire and canopy cover. How about lichen abundance or biomass, or relative abundance of crustose, foliose, fructicose species?
Yeah, great question. I like it. So I only looked at macrolichens, which is foliose and fructicose. My guess is the crusts don't love the high severity fire either, so they may take a little while to come back. When it comes to biomass, these are dry Sierra Nevada forests. The biomass is, I mean, maybe I wouldn't call it high in any cases. It maybe gets moderate in some cases. These are relatively low biomass systems compared to, say, your wetter forests on the Klamath side or Coast Range side. But yeah, I think the overall biomass would correlate with the richness patterns that we observed, and probably abundance would too. But you're not getting up to these dense mats of beautiful hair lichens like you get in some other places, which was actually why this was an easy place to do the study, because the plots didn't take very long. When you only have a max of like 8 macrolichens, it goes pretty quick. This would be, yeah, you'd be there all day if you were like in the Coast Range somewhere with like 80 species or whatever. Pro tips, low diversity ecosystems. Yeah, thanks for the question. Great question.
All right, I have a question about some of the patterns that you've seen after fire. And I know you focused on fires that were 9 to 15 years, that had happened 9 to 15 years previously. And so this is kind of a hypothetical question. If you were to keep watching those areas and as time since fire continues, do you think that those patterns would persist? Or do you think that they might disappear as there's more time for species from the ecoregion to recolonize those burned areas?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, that's kind of the ultimate question. Yeah, like, what is the long-term trajectory? The thing that's striking to me is just the persistence of these vast shrublands that we're seeing after these high severity burn zones. I mean, every time I go up to the Tahoe Basin, I drive past the Angora fire, where I spent months with Jonah getting whitethorn stuck in our knees. And man, it's like, just doesn't seem like we sampled it in 2016 and it doesn't seem any different now than it was, like no obvious sign that it's changing, except in the very limited places where they've gone in and planted trees. So it seems like that, I think the low severity and moderate severity burn zones, we can expect them to revert to pre-fire, or we can expect them to change faster, but it just seems like these high severity burn zones that are locked in shrubland, they might be like that for a long time. That's my feeling. But Jonah Weeks is actually analyzing the long-term data from something like 10 years of post-Angora fire. So it will be really interesting. I won't preempt her results here, but her paper will hopefully be out soon, and that will be a great answer to your question.
Great, looking forward to Jonah's paper. I think she was on here earlier. Okay, another question here from Ian Mott. Should the conversion of lower elevation forested yellow pine forests to shrubland have had impacts on hydrology, either at the local or landscape level? I'm thinking about soil water retention and snow retention. I'm curious if post-fire hydrology changes could be partly responsible for these stark changes in what we see on the landscape post-high severity fire, or if you'd figure it's mostly soil, climate, seed establishment ability that's preventing reestablishment of yellow pine.
Great question. Yeah, that's something I've thought about. You know, one thing we noticed when we were out in some of these high severity burn patches, I especially remember in some of the red fir forests in Yosemite, they were just like swampy. Like our boots were just getting soaked when we were walking around in them. And they were areas that, you know, I would guess they were not nearly as wet before the fire. So yeah, I think hydrology is probably a huge part of the story. And I do know of some, I think there will be some interesting research coming out about that in the near future too. I don't know how much has already been done. But then for the second question, my understanding is the conventional wisdom is for yellow pine reestablishment, seed limitation is really a huge factor. The seeds just don't travel very far. Kevin Welch, also a colleague from UC Davis, did a study and found that once you get more than 80 meters from the seed source, yellow pine regeneration drops off to almost nothing. So yeah, my sense is that's really one of the biggest limiting factors for post-fire regeneration. So yeah, great question, thanks.
All right, thank you. Well, the questions have kind of slowed down, so I wanted to thank you again, Jesse, for this great presentation, and thank everybody who attended the presentation today. If you come up with any other burning questions, you have Jesse's contact information there. You can ask him later, and I'm sure he'd be happy to respond. Our next Feral/California Fire Science Consortium webinar will take place on February 18th by Dr. Peter Freer-Smith. And you can check out the California Fire Science Consortium website for more details as they become available. So thank you all and take care.
Thanks, everyone.